Yes, good, good. I saw the thumbs up. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. We're delighted tonight to have the good fortune to have our friend and colleague, Dr. Jim O'Connell, and I'm going to turn it over to him in about 5 seconds. So just a word about what we're doing here. This is, thanks first of all to Cambridge Public Library for sponsoring our talk tonight. This is NAMI, N-A-M-I, National Alliance on Mental Illness, and we are a volunteer group around the country. This happens to be the Cambridge Middlesex affiliate, and we are here to help families who have a loved one with severe mental illness, and we exist because the system is, shall we say, not perfect, and so the availability of mental health services is somewhat lacking, or often lacking, and so we're here to fill that in a little bit. And just a couple words about Jim, and I'm going to turn it over to him. So I actually started as a doctor in 1985, and Dr. O'Connell started around 1985. I was at New England Deaconess. He was across the river at Mass General. When I was a doctor at the Deaconess as an internist, I spent 5 years at Massachusetts Mental Health Center, as the consultant, so I got a good dose of our Boston's patients with severe mental illness. And then we had a family member who's experienced some mental illness. He's doing great presently, and that brought our family into NAMI. And Linda Brown, Linda, where are you? Are you here somewhere? Oh, here's Linda. So Linda used to work with Jim, and with Linda's suggestion, why don't we have Jim come speak? Because we at NAMI see a lot of intersection between homelessness and mental illness. So that was the theme for tonight. So Jim, thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to you, and then we're gonna do Q&A, and if you have a question, raise your hand. Francis and John will come around with cards and a pen, and just write your question down, pass it up, and I'm sure we'll get to all your questions. So raise your hand, they'll come around. Thank you, Jim. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich. Actually, thank you very much, Rich, and thank you to Linda, who is the reason I'm here tonight. But and I'll tell you a little bit about how long and how intimately Linda and I had to work together on this program many years ago. But I thought I'm just going to show you a few. Am I doing that? I'm sorry.
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. I thought I would share with you a little bit about how I got started in all this, and then I'm mostly looking forward to questions and answers, because the one thing I know is I've gotten further along, and this is 40 years now. You realize this is 40 years, Rich. And I was finishing residency in 1985, so it's 40 years of the same job. And I'm a little nervous that I know less about it right now than I felt I knew back in 1985. So I'd love to share that with you. But going back to the beginning, so picture this. So I'm finishing residency. I was going to become an oncologist and do end-of-life care. That's what I wanted to do. And I had a fellowship all planned. I had my life all planned out. And I didn't get to medical school till I was 30, so I'm obviously much older, and I'm thinking, great, I'm gonna have my job. But my chief of medicine sort of twisted my arm, probably a little bit harder than I would have liked, to do this job for a year. It was a grant given to the city of Boston to try to take care of homeless people from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And the homeless people that put this grant together with the mayor insisted on a full-time doctor, and they couldn't find one. So I think my chief of medicine knew vulnerable people when he saw them. But what I didn't know until I started was that our program was put together by these really feisty people who had lived in the shelters or on the streets, many of whom suffered from all the things you can imagine. You know, this complicated, sort of medical illness with mental health and substance use issues and the whole vortex of that. And this is a later picture of that group, because they put together what they thought, how they wanted to be served. It wasn't how we wanted to be served. And so when I took this job, we were handed the model of care that we had to then use. And to this day, we still have this consumer advisory board, which I'm sure you would appreciate, of whom 5 to 6 of them are on our board of directors. So I've always lived in a world where the people we serve are actually the people that hire and fire us. And it's the best thing that ever happened to us. Not at all what I was prepared to do. I won't show you any two slides with words on them, but this is what they came up with. They met with the mayor's office all through the winter of 1984-85, and they came up with this is what they wanted. And it haunts me a little bit because they were certainly way ahead of us. What they wanted was continuity of care. That's what they thought was missing in their lives, in the systems, et cetera. And they wanted the same thing most of us would want. In those days, it was primarily doctors, but it was nurse practitioners and PAs soon to come, but people who would be with them, be their medical home, and not people like me who are coming to spend a year and then go do our career somewhere else. So they wanted that continuity, but they wanted it from shelter and street. This is taken from a Halen Door document that they made the mayor sign, from shelter and street right through to the hospital. And their perception, which is often forgotten now, is that when they were really sick, they ended up in the hospital, and that's when they felt most disenfranchised, most stigmatized, and most in need of someone who knew them. So they insisted that we had to be involved in their care when they went to the hospital, but that we had to get out of the hospital and go do our clinics out in the shelters and on the streets, wherever homeless people were. And I thought that was pretty brilliant. They made us work in teams. So as Linda will remember very well, I've never had a panel of patients of my own. I've always shared it with a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant, and a social worker, and now a psychiatrist, and a recovery coach. But we all share equally in the care of those folks. And I thought this was brilliant multidisciplinary approach. But what they were doing was hedging the bet on continuity. They just didn't want, and as I mentioned, I took this job thinking they were going to love. I'm here, I'm going to give a whole year of giving back and giving it. And they hated that. They said, we don't want to get to know you, really, share with you. And then after a year, you're just going to get up and do your career somewhere else. They hated that. So they figured as long as I was sharing the care with other people, if I left, there'd still be other people that each person would know and could be continuous. And the last thing they asked us to do was respite care. Many of you may know we have the long story of respite care. Was basically, folks back then were really angry with us, the docs and the hospitals, for discharging them to the streets or to the shelters when they were still really sick. And most people go home with a family and visiting nurse and a home health aide, but they had nothing but the streets and a park bench. So they insisted that we come up with this thing they called medical respite care. And that, if any of you follow us, that's our Barbara McGinnis house today. We have about 104 beds of real, pretty intense step-down hospital care for people coming out of the hospital. But that was not our idea. That was all the idea of the people we were serving. But then they I'm so sorry about that, geez. But then they did this really interesting twist, which I didn't see until almost 2 years later, that if they were going to go along with the mayor, it had to be based on social justice and not on charity. Okay, and I had zero, I was coming out of medical school and residency, and I had marched in the 60s, but during medical school and that, I had forgotten everything I knew about social justice. I was all into learning this stuff. And so we were not allowed to use a single volunteer because they thought volunteers smacked of charity. And I had, by the way, gotten so many of my friends who were all going to volunteer, we were all going to contribute, we were all going to do, my friends were going into dermatology, we were going to do it, friends in cardiology, so we figured we could put it all together. But they wanted nothing to do with that. They thought that smacked of charity. And so the other thing they wouldn't let us do is use students. Okay, and by students, they also meant interns and residents in the hospital they considered student doctors, right? So I was horrified because I had just come out of MGH for 3 days and students were involved in everything we did. When Henry Kissinger came in for surgery, he had a student who did the first, thing. So it was just part of what we did. But to them, and this is what I had to learn to do, crawl into their perspective, they had only seen students come and listen to their hearts and lungs, or feel their, do sort of exam practicing, and then none of them ever came back to care for them. They just learned that and went on through. So they didn't want to be guinea pigs anymore. Little did I know, that's it. But if you look at this, the third and fourth were kind of interesting. We couldn't do any research, and I'd come out of a world where everything you do, you want to look at the program and see if it's working and then improve it by whatever you're finding in that. They didn't want any research. And it was because there had been a really good study done by a Harvard psychiatrist, really wonderful, who had looked at family shelters back in 1984 and 85. The family shelters had opened their doors to these researchers. They came in and got to know the moms and the kids, and they wrote this really really interesting and fabulous paper that I thought was a clarion call to get people to pay attention to this. But what they found was that most of the moms, and these were primarily single mom, head of household, most of the moms had lived through hell. The story of the trauma they had lived through and the journey to homelessness was just horrifying, and they were seriously in need of lots of help. And the kids, when they looked at the kids, 50% of them, as I said, were in need of immediate psychiatric care. And this paper came out, and I couldn't see, I mean, just paralyzed me that we need to go help. But this is something I learned, and you would all know this well, that went counter to what the advocacy community was doing at the time. And I don't know any of this, I know nothing about homelessness when I came in to do this, but they were assaulting the government for getting out of the business of building housing. And the HUD budget had gone from 90 billion down to 20 billion for the very low income housing. And consequently, there was almost no low income housing being built. And then you see homelessness rise. And they were saying, we wouldn't have homelessness if we would keep building homes. And this paper they saw as a blame the victim. And it allowed the government to say, it's not a problem of housing, it's a problem of broken people. And it set up a dynamic which has lasted, I would argue, also to today. So I learned that there's always this kind of little tension between doing research and finding the best way to do things and what you're adopting to do for advocacy. And we could talk about that later on. The last thing, though, I want you to pay attention to is they would not allow us to do mental health services. So when we started, I was blown away. I could not write a script for an antidepressant. I couldn't do anything that was in the mental health psychiatry world. And that was because the homeless community at that time was furious with the Department of Mental Health writ large for not coming up with the community-based services that had been promised under deinstitutionalization. That what they had done is emptied all the hospitals, but then not provided the care. And shelters like Pine Street would argue that they were de facto the largest mental health facilities in the state as a result of all that. So they didn't want some little program like ours letting the state or anyone else off the hook. So we were pretty much confined to doing medical care when we first started. By the way, all of this lasted for about 5 years, and after that was all gone. So this is not anymore. We had to earn our stripes. But when I look back on that, I realized it formed us and formed the way I think, the lens through which we've tended to see the world. But it was pretty shocking to me, as you can imagine. Then you probably, if you've ever heard me talk, this is my humility picture, because when I first got to Pine Street, my last job at Mass General was to be, and Rich, you would appreciate this, I was a senior medical resident in charge of the ICU, right? So in June, I think I am God's gift to medicine, because I can run the ICU. And then on July 1st, I'm going 6 blocks down the street to Pine Street Inn's shelter clinic, right? And I figured, how hard can that be? And I never forget walking in, and it's chaos. You know, there's 800 people were at Pine Street at the time. And it was wonderful. I mean, it was safe, but it was chaotic, noise, everything. And you could go into the clinic, which was run by the nurses. And this is teaching me that I talk with my hands and I shouldn't here. It was run by these fabulous nurses who had been doing this for like 15 years, taking care of homeless people in the clinic. They were, in fact, at that time, the only independently licensed nurses clinic in the country. So if any of you are nurses, I have an older sister who's a nurse, you can imagine how thrilled they were to have a doctor come join them, right? So I had to learn, here I am at my first job ever as a doctor, thinking everybody would be thrilled, and they were just really skeptical. And what the nurses did, though, was brilliant. They invited people in, and they realized in the chaos, it was all calm. They called everybody by their name. Mr. Williams, come in, let us soak your feet. And they would do something like that. And I was stunned because these really crusty, tough people would just melt when the nurses said their name with dignity and kindness. I was thinking most of them never heard anybody call them by their name, at least certainly not with kindness. And then the nurses invited them in to soak their feet. And the brilliance of that is it puts you at the foot of the person you're serving. You're way away from their personal space. And it's asking them what they want, not telling them what we want to do. And so I'll never forget Barbara McGinnis, who was a nurse who made me, for 2 months, that's all I could do was soak feet. I couldn't use my stethoscope, couldn't do anything else. And I could give you lots of stories about that. But this was a gentleman that taught me just about everything I know now. And Barbara made me soak his feet. His feet are so swollen it requires 2 buckets. Most people only can fit their feet in 1 bucket. And I had known this man from the emergency room, Mass General, seen him dozens of times. And we had written, he suffered from a paranoid version of schizophrenia, long-standing, and in his chart, it had been written he was treatment resistant. I'll never forget seeing that. And it was true. Whenever the police or somebody brought him into the emergency room, usually because his legs were infected, he would never do anything we said, nothing. And so we sort of had to start to give up on him. And so Barbara has me soaking his feet, and I don't know if you've heard this story, I've said this a few times, but after about a month, he never looked at me except with that wry look, and I couldn't get anything out of him, but I was kept, as Barbara said, I couldn't ask anything about IU, having chest pain or hearing, I couldn't do any of that. I had to just say anything else I could do for you. And he looked down one night and he said, hey, I thought you were supposed to be a doctor. And he was the first person at Pine Street Inn in a month that had actually mentioned that I was a doctor. So I lit up just like everybody else does when you're getting your feet soaked. And he said, well, what the hell are you doing soaking feet? And I had no idea what to say to him except to pointed to Barbara and I said, I don't know, I just do what the nurses tell me to do. And he laughed. It's the first time I'd ever seen him laugh. And he chuckled because he said, you know, I've been coming here for years and they're the only people who I will do something for. So he put me in this category. We were both doing what the nurses told us. And then, as you can imagine, you know, after about another couple of weeks, he asked me one night if I could give him something to help him sleep. And I went, oh, sure. And then I debated, what do you do? And I gave him, I can't remember what it was now, but it was probably a little bit of Haldol, because that was the safest thing we had at the time for sleep. And he came back a couple nights later and he said, Doc, that was okay, but it didn't get me much sleep. Can you give me something else? And we changed things around. And I realized after about another month, he was taking all of the medications that we had spent 25 years at Mass General saying he was resistant to taking. So it was my learning through the nurses that it's all about earning trust. It's all about getting people used to, about what the people said, it's about continuity. You have to be there, be present. I had to learn how to break all the usual, professional boundaries that we had said. We had coffee with people, we talked to them, we shared stories, you did all the things that let them know that the distance between the two of us was not as big as we might think. But anyway, so that was my sort of I think the thing that set me off. And then I'm gonna stop here and go to questions because I have a lot of stories we could talk about, but I think it's probably much more important. As I think of this now, 40 years down the road, there's been lots of successes and lots of failures and lots of different approaches we've tried. And if anything, we've learned that we have to stay open to all sorts of possibilities for everyone we see and try to find the way that they might be able to find the way that we can help them as opposed to us having an idea that they should do. So I'm going to stop there, if I may, Rich, and just put another.
We'll have a conversation.
I was telling Rich that I've become very powerful because I learned if I push B, everything goes black.
Great, thank you, Jim. So here's this works for you. Try that. And I'll try this. So I have a few questions for you, but Francis has some cards and pens. So raise your hand. He'll come around and write your question. He'll bring them up here. We'll ask all your questions. It'll be wonderful. So a couple things. So NAMI, obviously, we're particularly interested in severe mental illness. How prevalent would you say mental illness, as we define it, is in your population? In order for someone to be homeless, by definition, did they have to have mental illness or not? Did they descend into it from life circumstances, or are there different routes to homelessness? Or tell us a little about your experience with that.
The way I've chosen to answer that, because it's a tough question, as all you may know, but what we learned, actually with the help of studies from other places, that if you look at all homeless people and say, how many of anyone who's homeless in Boston this year, how many would have a severe and persistent mental illness? It's relatively low. If you take those people who have been out there for a year or more, it gets very high. So what you miss in the numbers is that the vast majority of homeless people come and stay. This is now a fact. If you look at 10 years of people coming in and out of the shelter, about 80% of the people that come into the shelter stay for less than a month and come once in that 10-year period, then they're gone. And when you look at how many of those people have major medical problems, substance use, it's very low. So the vast majority of homeless people are just people that are struggling, and they're going to figure a way to, with a little help, they're going to figure out how to get out of that. The problem is that about 20% of people, and I could be more specific, are in the shelters either all the time or in and out over that 10-year period. And those are the people when you start to say how many of those have mental illness. If you look at the chronic, what the government now calls the chronic homeless population, meaning you've been outside, or I mean you've been in homeless now for a year or longer, or had 3 episodes that last over a year, over the last 4 years or something. Those people have huge burdens of co-occurring medical, psychiatric, and substance use disorders. And they're the ones that we see, because you go to Pine Street at any given night, and this is all just the way health plans think, but 50% of the beds on any given night are taken up by that 10% of the folks. So it looks higher than it is, not to diminish it in any way, but I think it means that it's a more, if we would just concentrate on those folks, we could probably really improve the services. If you look at it as thousands of people need the service, then people give up.
So, I neglected to say at the beginning when I introduced you that you are the president of Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, and you've built a really amazing thing down there that most people don't know about. Thanks, Francis. So, you thought you were just going to spend 1 year there, and now you're somewhere around 40 years there. And just give the audience, by the way, there are 2 books that I will tell you about that I read that are great. One that Jim wrote, Out of the Shadows. Did I get the title? Stories from the Shadows. It's a wonderful book of stories about patients that you've interacted with. And then there's a book by Tracy Kidder called Rough Sleepers, which is about the work that you do. But just tell us a little bit about the magnitude of the organization. How big is it? How many providers do you have? How many patients do you serve? Kind of what's the magnitude?
I'd be happy to, and this is where I get to embarrass Linda a little bit. So we were originally a very small program with a grant funded. We didn't have a finance department. We didn't send any bills. We just went out and took care of people. And there were like 6 or 7 of us back in 1985. But then we had to learn when that grant ended. I don't know how many of you had to deal with grants. Grants are wonderful, but they end. And then you have to figure out how do you sustain.
Or they take them away.
Or oh my God, now that.
I'm sorry.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. I didn't even want to go there. But we then were, to sustain ourselves, we were deemed by the government to become what's called a federally qualified health center, which means you can bill Medicaid, and we could sustain ourselves by learning how to bill Medicaid, which meant we had to have a finance department and learn how to bill. And that's where Linda came. We had no finance person. We found Linda, who I'll never forget, seemed to disappear into this office that was in no lamp, or it had just a little lamp, no windows. And Linda came out like 6 months later with a plan for how we were going to survive, right, Linda? And so we've lived on a basically, we operate like some hybrid between community health center and hospital. That's right. So the lucky thing is that we were asked to go out and deliver care wherever homeless people were. So we have probably about 30 clinics. Most of the shelters, in fact, I would say all of the adult shelters and the family shelters in Boston, are docs and nurses do clinics regularly in all of those. Like Pine Street Inn, we have a clinic 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. St. Francis House, we do that clinic every day. So it's actually been really wonderful because we get to go and visit other people and be guests there and take care of people, which takes the burden of healthcare off the shelter so they can sort of concentrate on other things. So we now have that network. We were required to stay based at the hospital, so we have a daily clinic at both Boston Medical Center and Mass General for homeless people. And then we have a street team. It turns out, I don't know what the statistic is in Cambridge, but in Boston, 96 to 97% of everybody who's homeless tonight will be in a shelter. And the other people, the 3%, will be outside, even though there is a shelter bed for them. So the folks who stay outside tend to be another subgroup when you say, what's the percentage of different things, when you say of that population, it goes sky high. And the reasons they don't go into the shelter are, as you can imagine, just legion. I made the mistake of asking somebody one night early on, why are you choosing to stay outside? And they got really mad. They all do. Because they're not choosing to stay outside. They would say they're choosing not to go to a 800-bed shelter, or they're choosing not to go somewhere where the CIA is going to be monitoring their thoughts. and then you can imagine, then it's a cascade event, but it's always very complicated. And you have to realize that this is, people that have huge obstacles to getting back into the mainstream. So what we do, we have a street team that learned after the first winter, we thought we were so good at getting all these shelter clinics, but the people who were dying primarily were staying outside. So we've had now for years a team that goes out and takes care of people out on the streets, both night and day. And then the last thing we have is that respite program I told you about. So it's the 2 hospital anchor clinics, 30 shelter clinics, street team, and the respite program.
Fantastic. So let's do some of the questions.
We serve about 11,000 homeless people every year.
Wow, that's really amazing.
It's gotten way bigger than we thought.
Yeah.
We have about 30 doctors, 40 nurse practitioners and BAs, probably 120, 130 nurses. So it's a lot. There's a lot going
that's
on.
amazing.
It's kind of crazy.
Okay, so let's do some of these questions. How do you suggest individuals with little experience working with mental illness engage with mental illness when working in shelters?
Boy, that's a great question. It kind of haunts me a little bit because as an intern, training in internal medicine, I needed serious training in how to engage people. So I think we all have to learn from, the way we've learned it is learning from the peers who teach us a lot. And we have several peers who work with us. But I think mostly what we learned was early on, we learned from the nurses how to just treat people normally and win their trust, and then just talk normally and invite them in normally. And that was hard for us because I was so used to having 15 minutes in an exam and getting everything. I'll never forget Barbara McGinnis. So when I was seeing somebody in one of the clinic rooms one night, I was frustrated because I was really worried about how to get to what was going on with this person. And she said, that may take 5 years, just take it easy. And I think we learned it's really, you stick with people and it may take a long time, it may take a short time, sometimes it takes 15 years. And I think that's what I would urge people to think that. It's a long process of earning trust.
Okay, here's one. Is there a way for family members to learn where their family member who is mentally ill and missing can be found? Could the ill person designate, while psychologically stable, someone who should be informed of his or her location? So that's the kind of question that comes up from our NAMI support groups about, my loved one is missing, what can I do? Does this come up with your population?
Yes, this comes up all the time, and that question kind of hurts me, and I'd love to know what you guys think, because HIPAA, which is the privacy thing, came up in like 1995, 96. And I remember prior to that, if somebody called and said their mother was outside, do you know where she is? If we knew where their mother was, we wanted to say, yes, you could. But now we can't do that legally, okay? And we can be prosecuted criminally if we reveal your presence when you haven't given me permission. So what we always hope is it's someone that we know well enough we can go and say, hey, somebody's looking for you, can we tell them or give them the number? And sometimes we just give them a number and say somebody's looking to get you. But we can't, and that's a very frustrating thing because someone is calling looking for their loved one, brother, sister, and I may know exactly where they are, but I have to say, don't give up, let me see what I could do, and just give some signal to say, it's not a no, but I've got to go make sure we get permission. I still think I guess that does protect privacy. I don't know where you all land on that, but it does, when somebody has a real thought disorder, and I'm thinking they would love to connect to their family, to not be able to get their permission to connect, that really feels like we're in the way rather than healing.
For those who read the book, Rough Sleepers, you talked a lot about a man named Tony who had a really interesting story, and this person asked, can you tell us what happened with him? Speaking of HIPAA.
Well, this one, because, by the way, it's a long story we could talk about with Tracy writing that book, because he had to get permission from he couldn't do anything without signed permissions. He had written a book about a friend of ours, Paul Farmer, you may know Paul, and when he had gone to Haiti, he didn't need permission. He just wrote the stories that he saw. But when you come to the streets of Boston or go to the clinics at Mass General, you have to have permission from from the hospital, from the clinic, from every person. So we spent a huge amount of time doing that. So Tony, who gave him permission to write his story, although Tracy changed his name. So I don't want to if you read the book, it comes out at near the end of the book what happens. But I don't know, it feels weird to say spoiler alert, but it's something, but, you know, tragically, you know, Tony died on the sidewalk, you know, sort of while Tracy was still writing the book. It was devastating for Tracy. He had gotten to know him really well. Devastating for all of us because he had become really part of our world. But he, one night on a very cold night, fell asleep on the sidewalk, and he didn't freeze to death, but he died of what was probably a heart attack.
So what's, you know, basically the longevity of the homeless relative to the rest of the population?
You know, we've done a lot of looking into this because it's hard to study homeless populations because you don't have a denominator. So you can say, we know this many people had this, but you don't know what the total number was. So it's very hard. But we were able, doing mortality is something you can actually do. So we know now, not only in Boston, but in many cities, if you live in a shelter, you will die at 4 times the rate of someone the same age who's housed in your city. 4 times. And then one of the things we don't know, why is it that? You know, what is it about homelessness? And it turns out it's very complicated. Sometimes it's cancer, sometimes it's heart disease, sometimes it's, you know, neglect or something. But if you live on the streets of Boston, I suspect it means the streets of Cambridge, you're 12 times more likely to die than someone the same age. So what we've had to realize is that even though you look out and you think these are rugged, tough survivalists, they have the highest premature mortality rate of almost any population in our country. And actually it rivals many sub-Saharan African countries, which have very high mortality rates. So it's really deadly and really important that we pay attention to people.
You may or may not be familiar with this question, but how do you think the Grants Pass Supreme Court decision from last term will affect unhoused populations? That was the decision about, I think it was about the rights of the unhoused.
This was, I guess you could guess from the way I sat up, what I feel about it. I feel it's, what happened, by the way, if you go to a West Coast city, I've spent a lot of time in LA and San Francisco, it's a little bit reversed. You know, I said in Boston, and I think probably in Cambridge, although I don't know the statistics for Cambridge, I'm sorry, but almost everybody is sheltered at nighttime, and you don't see that many people outside. We think it's way too many, but it's relative to LA or San Francisco, it's like a tiny number. And that's because they don't have very many shelter beds. Weather's arguably nicer, and consequently, they don't have as many services going out. We have them because it's on cold weather, people die. But what happened before that, there was a city of Boise, which might have had 6 homeless people, but they were all living on the main street. The city of Boise tried to move them off the street into someplace out from downtown. And there was a Ninth Court's decision, which was approved by the Supreme Court, which said, you can't move somebody unless you have a place to offer them. So you can't just come in and say, you've got to leave. You have to say, we've got a shelter bed, or we've got a place for you to go over here. And the Grants Pass thing was done by later on, it was 5 years after that, or 6 years after that, where they just said, we don't have capacity, but we don't want these people in our spot. So they approved, the Supreme Court said, okay, that you can just now move people and you don't have to have a place for them. So that's what Grants Pass means. You can come and sweep people off. And you know, in many cities where that's become such a problem, like in San Francisco, the businesses are desperate to get people moved from in front of the doors of their stores, et cetera, and you get a lot of animosity toward homeless people. But they don't, at the same time, they haven't created housing or shelters for those people to go to. So I think it's tragedy. I understand why you need to move people or say it's not good to sleep in the middle of, you know, downtown, but you really should have a place for people to go so that you can say.
Here's a related question. What do you think are the ethics of giving someone who is panhandling money?
Ooh, that's a below-the-belt question.
Well, that's why I asked, because you're the guy who can answer it.
So a couple of things. I remember when I first started working, when I'd go to Pine Street or Long Island Shelter, you'd get asked by dozens, if not hundreds of people for money or something. They just wanted something. And I remember going to Barbara and some of the nurses about, how do you handle this? This is terrible. And I was, you know, to not give them something felt terrible. But I didn't have any money at the time. It was hard to give money to 50 people a day. And I remember Barbara saying something which has stuck with me, and I've heard you may know this, and forgive me if it's, she just said, please remember that people are looking to be not invisible, to be acknowledged. And she would say, you don't have to give them money. In fact, don't give them money. You know, give them whatever you want. But most of all, you want to look them in the eye and say, how you doing today? Sorry, don't have any money, but how you in? And she said, do that consistently, and then, and when you talk to our consumer advisory board of homeless people, that's really what they're looking for. They're looking to not be invisible to all of us. Now, all the rest is gravy. Now, then the question becomes, do you give them $5 or $10 or something like that? And the downside is you don't know what they're going to use it for. And the upside is they're poor. If you think of most homeless people have no money. And it's not like they can go home and get something out of the bank or something. And I've had a hard time coping with that. Imagine being outside with, you know, no skills, your family's decided, and you don't have any money. You have no way to get any money. So the only way they can get it is by panhandling. And for most of them, I would argue there's significant degrees of severe and persistent mental illness, which is keeping them from being able to get a steady job. Or there's other medical problems. Or trauma that really gets in the way. So I've had a hard time just begrudging giving money to people. And when I give money, I try not to think about, this is money for you, you decide what to give with. But that's very controversial. A lot of people on our program would just say never give money. What the compromise we have, and you probably all know this, is we tend to give Dunkin' Donuts cards, which sounds a little crazy, but a Dunkin' Donuts card used to be a $5 Dunkin' Donuts card, but I've been assaulted by many of our folks now, so you can't get much for $5 in Dunkin' Donuts anymore. But it gets people they're able to go inside. You can legitimately get a cup of coffee and sit down in the warm. And prior to COVID, they all had bathrooms. So you had a little card like that, got all that for you. And I can promise you, I've never had anybody in the streets who's not been overjoyed to get a $5 Dunkin' Donuts card. And it took all the pressure off, what do we give them?
Thank you, that was a great answer. Here's a challenging one, as if they're not all challenging. Can you speak about the issue of women and homelessness, mental illness? My daughter has schizoaffective disorder and has had bouts of homelessness, although I don't think she has spent any time in a shelter. She gets taken in by men who give her drugs and traffic her until she lands back in the hospital. What are you doing, if anything, to reach this population?
That's an all too familiar story, and one that haunts us as a program. So we've spent a lot of time developing our women's health services. And so a couple things I would say. I work very closely with a psychiatrist named Eileen Riley. Linda knows her well. And she sort of specializes in exactly this. Before she went to medical school, founded a place called the Women's Lunch Place. Do you guys know about the Women's Lunch Place? And it's primarily for women who are coming in for safety. And they have all sorts of amazing services there. We have a clinic there. Eileen and the psychiatrist go, there's therapists there. And then it's a place where they've got great food, really nice. They've got everything for women there. And it's a safe place, not just for homeless women, for women, any women who want to go in there. And every time I look at that, I think, oh, that's kind of really that's the model for me. It's in the basement of the Church of the Covenant on Newbury Street. So it's in a beautiful spot, in a basement that's been done over and is beautiful. We have, in the last several years, opened a clinic for women only in St. Anthony's Shrine downtown. I don't know if you know that. So we built a clinic that is, our nurse practitioner, one of our doctors, goes with some people from the shrine, and it's only women, and down there is an area where women are frequently trafficked. It's downtown crossing, lots of drugs there. And the women can come in and shelter, and we can do all sorts of things with them. So we've learned that targeted women's services are really important for safety and things. And we on Saturdays close our building, our main building downtown, and have what they call a Her Saturday, and everything is there. All our clinicians, and it's all women, our clinicians are there, so you can get whatever you need medically, and then there's bingo, movies. It's just a kind of a festive occasion only for women, and that's where we learn a lot about what women are going through. But I can also say that on the street at nighttime or on the van and during the day, there's still an awful lot of women we haven't been able to get to, and the trafficking gets incredibly complicated. Mass and Cass, which all of you know about, the thing as mixed feelings as everybody had Mass and Cass, the number of women who were stuck in those tents and being trafficked was just horrifying. And so it was hard not to say we really want to fix this. So it's a terrible problem.
Okay, here's not a question, this is a comment. I worked at Mass General for 30 years and loved being in the Wang lobby on Thursday mornings. It was a privilege to talk to the many patients who were coming to see you. Loved that the psychiatry residents washed feet too. So that was a comment.
I love that comment, by the way, and we have a clinic. This just sounds self-serving, but we realized it was so hard. It's hard enough to get anyone who's homeless to try to come into the clinic for when you need to do things like, MRIs and stuff like that. It's hard if you're living in the immediacy of trying to survive outside, trying to come to an appointment, especially if it's next Tuesday at 4 o'clock, you're never going to make it. So we've learned everything has to be immediate. And one of the things about the street folks is they hated coming to the hospital because they can't shower, they come in as they are, and they feel really stigmatized, not only when they get admitted, but even in the clinic. So Mass General let us have a special clinic on Thursdays, which this is where we could just invite people in, and we had, it was kind of festive. We had coffee, donuts, meal tickets, lots of volunteers around, and we could see people for all their medical and psychiatric issues in that setting. And what we found is that it became like a community, it became like a community belonging. So we thought no one would come at first. It turns out that 80 or 90 people would show up. And I think most of them didn't really want to be seen medically, they just wanted to be there. And we realized that the community part of it was really what's important. To this day, that's been the thing. I love being on the van at nighttime, but that Thursday clinic, whoever said that comment, thank you, I'm in the same boat. It just makes you feel good.
Here's an interesting question. I have a neighbor, so not homeless, with schizophrenia. His behavior scares many people, both in the apartment building and in the neighborhood. Is there any way to have him consistently treated for his psychiatric disease? I fear he may be evicted because he is treatment resistant. How do we avoid having him become homeless?
The toughest issue we faced, because we're so far downstream, is how to prevent homelessness. And this is exactly what haunts me. That's someone who could really, if there's help given to that person now, it would prevent the eviction and certainly prevent coming out to the streets. Once they're out to the streets and everything falls apart, it becomes much more expensive, just to think of the hospitals, emergency rooms, police. So I dream of how we can answer, and that probably isn't going to be us. It has to be, that's where I look to systems like the Department of Mental Health or something, where we can flood people with services before they become homeless, instead of flooding them with services after they're homeless. And I can tell you millions of cases we've had where no one could respond to that, then that person does become homeless. And you realize with a little bit of effort on the other end, we could have prevented that.
Let me ask you a question about doctor, nurse, provider, compassion, fatigue. So I work part-time for Care Dimensions Hospice, and some people ask, well, isn't that hard, and how can you do it? And yes, it can be emotionally draining, but you've been doing this for 40 years. So what are the qualities that it takes for someone to be able to be a provider for a long time with this population that's so demanding and so draining and emotionally challenging? So how do you balance your empathy with also protecting your own self emotionally?
That's a great and important question. And my father used to think I had a character flaw for doing this. And then he would say, when am I going to get a job? I'll never forget that. Until he was about 90. Then he relented and said, okay, that's your job. What I would say to that is I've had the luxury of coming into something that was designed by the people we're serving. So that helped, okay? And it absolved me from what I had learned, the 15-minute visits in the clinics and all of that. And it was slow down, basically, is what I was told. And then we had a chance to get to know people. And I remember it was frustrating during the first few months, By the way, I should have said when I started at Pine Street, it was also when the first person who was homeless with AIDS showed up, and we had an outbreak of multi-drug tuberculosis. So when I said we were only doing medical stuff in the beginning, it was overwhelming because everybody was dying. We had no treatment for the AIDS. The TB required 4 medicines every day for 18 months to treat somebody adequately so they don't pass it on. So I remember just being overwhelmed. And I think I never burned out because it was so complicated. But then as time went on, I think what happens to everybody, at least to all of our clinicians, is you get so angry that society lets this happen, and you just want to scream. And I'll never forget Barbara McGinnis one day chastising me for, when I was raging against the system or something. And she looked at me and she said, "What do you think, you're God or something?" She said, "Just get to work." And there was something of a release in that, that we weren't there to end homelessness, even though we want it. We weren't there to fix it, but we were there to take care of the people in front of us. And that was our entire attention. And there was something miraculous once the nurses taught us that's what we're doing, that we started to learn as we got to know folks. The stories they have are just amazing. And you realize that they've lived through hell. They've been dealt the worst hand you can imagine, yet they are still appreciative of the care you give them, and they are happy to talk to you as they get to know you. And so I think the joy, if you come to our program, even though the backdrop is tragic, there's a certain joy in every day. And the last thing I would say is because they forced us to always work in a team, I've never had the burden of caring for somebody all by myself. I've always, so the sorrows you can spread out as well as the joys. And I can give you all sorts of stories about one great example of this is end-of-life care. And one of the first months I was at Pine Street, this man came in who I used to love. He had this cackle of a laugh that you could be in the 800 people on the thing, you could hear his laugh above everybody else. He was a character. His name was Amerigo. And he came in one night and he was just angry. He holds up his bottle of vodka, which you weren't supposed to have in the shelter anyway. And he said, "Doc, you gotta do something. I can't swallow this damn stuff." And I hadn't had that chief complaint before, so I was like, not sure how to respond. But it turned out he had a huge cancer in his esophagus, so he couldn't swallow. And he told me, as I got the story from him, he hadn't been able to swallow food for weeks and weeks, but he could always get his vodka down so he could keep going. And that was another lesson I learned, that, preventive care is hard. Most people will go until something doesn't function. Like I can't walk on my leg or I can't swallow anymore. So anyway, we did the whole thing, and it was very advanced and untreatable esophageal cancer. And we put a tube in to bypass the obstruction so we could feed him. And then I spent a whole weekend getting him into a nursing home in South Boston, where I knew at least he could die with some comfort and dignity. And I was so proud of myself. Did all the this is before computers, did all the paperwork. Got him there, picked him up on Monday and brought him over there, and I said, "Here you are." And it was actually he had grown up in South Boston. It was in South Boston, had a view of the water. And I was very proud of myself. Although I was sad that this poor man was probably not going to live many more weeks. And I came back to Pine Street, what it was, 2 days later for my evenings, and I can hear this laugh going on. And I was, I'm saying, "Uh-oh." And I walked out, and he's outside with all his friends, and he's laughing away and telling a story, and he's got his feeding tube, and he's pouring the vodka around. And I was like, I didn't know whether to kill him or to, and then he stood up and he said, "Hey, Doc, let me tell you." He said, "I really appreciate all you've been doing." He said, "But you sent me to that place. I didn't know anybody." He said, "And the people I did try to talk to were either staring out the window or watching TV, and I didn't know anybody." He said, "I had to leave. This is my people. This is where I want to die. I want to die with these." And I had never thought to ask him what he wanted to do. And so that was the first time. This is early. This is September maybe of 1985. And the nurses at Pine Street, God bless them, agreed to let him stay there, and we let him stay at Pine Street to die at Pine Street, and we could do the tube feedings and stuff. And what I learned in that is people want to die around the people they care about. Yeah. And when you don't have a family, the people you care about is your community of friends. So in our McGinnis house, as Linda knows well, one of the things we have to do relatively frequently is let people die there. And it's important not for the person dying, but for the people that know them. And that, you know, what I always think about with that is the sadness is overwhelming, but there's a certain real, this was important and right to do.
Right, great. And that resonates with the hospice work that we do. It's very similar. Here's a question about elderly with mental health problems, suburban versus rural. And what are your thoughts about, we're talking today about the city, Boston, but what about rural homelessness, especially older people?
Boy, that's a great question, and I have to plead, as much as I've tried to learn about it, rural homelessness is a whole different issue, because, you know, we go out in the van at night and scour the city of Boston, and you can see 50, 60, 80 people. But when I have some friends that are out in North Dakota and go out and try to find the people that are living, they can go all night long and see 2 people because they have to drive 50 and 30 and something miles. So it's a very different approach. And then when they do see somebody, services are usually a long way away. So there's a lot of interest now in how to improve rural health, particularly in the VA work, because many veterans end up in rural areas. How can you do a good job with that? And I'm no expert because I'm so city focused now in how we approach things. By the way, just as another interesting thing, do you know that if you look at adult homelessness, about somewhere around 40% to almost 50% of all adult homeless people in the US are in California and New York. And the number of people in rural areas is very small when you look at the national statistics. So it's a small number of people scattered over a huge area. And so the challenges are equally huge to take care of that. And the approach, totally different, obviously, because I certainly don't know how to do it.
So here's another question kind of along the lines of the big picture. What model can you imagine that would solve homelessness? Is it housing first? Is it the continuity of care that the original Healthcare for the Homeless founders envisioned? Service-enriched housing? Are there good models elsewhere in the country? And I would ask in the world while we're at it.
That opens up a whole Pandora's box. So we talk a lot about being caught in this kind of interesting world where we've had to accept that we don't end homelessness. We're taking care of people. And as you take care of people, we're not fixing the housing problem. We're not fixing the larger problems. So when I step back and I think about, you know, what is driving homelessness in our country, I think you really have to accept that it's for sure a lack of housing, because without enough housing, you're never going to solve it. But when you see who has become homeless and stayed there the longest, it's usually people who have been failed by our school systems, failed by our welfare system, failed by our mental health systems, and our medical systems, public health systems, you know, and failed by our justice system. And so I don't think we're ever going to end homelessness till we really address those issues. And the housing that we have to scale up is on another dimension. Nobody in the country is talking about the level of housing that we need to solve this problem. But I now turn around. In the meantime, we have all these people that are suffering, who are going to be suffering for the next many years until we fix that. And somebody has to take care of them. So I worry a lot about, you know, when I look at somebody and they say, what are you doing to end homelessness? I have to say, I'm not. I'm taking care of people. And then they want to say, let's put all our money into the solutions, which I kind of agree with. But at the same time, please, these are people that deserve care, and we really need to take care of them. So don't get caught in that trap of, you know, should we put our money into one versus the other? It's both and, you know, we need both things being looked at. But I can't imagine abandoning the people that are suffering alone outside, who are not likely to get housed in the next many years.
Here's a related question. How does Boston Healthcare for the Homeless coordinate with all the other organizations in the greater Boston area that serve the homeless? This is a several-part question. Should we say homeless or unhoused, or both, or does it matter? Is this a success story, not a success story? And the paradox, by funding Boston Healthcare for the Homeless et al. Fully, can we eliminate the need for them? So I can review all that many-part question if you need it, or maybe you got it all.
That's an interesting and fascinating question. Can I start with one part of it, though?
You can take the crib notes there.
So one thing, can I talk about terminology for a moment? Because this has been a 40-year journey, right? And our program is called the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless Program. Healthcare with 2 words, because healthcare in 1985 was 2 words. Now it's 1 word. The world is 1 word. But you never would say the homeless anymore. Just, it's improper, right? Homeless should never be a noun. I think that's what we all now kind of agree on. But we have these feisty people on our board of directors that are very particular about how they want to be talked about. So, for example, we used to say, all the time we would say mental health and substance use services or psychiatric and addictions care, and then it became behavioral health. You probably all know that. So it's behavioral health now, which then includes both of those things. And our board went crazy when we started to use the word behavioral health, because they said, are you impugning our behavior? And that's how they heard it. So we started to realize we're talking about how we feel better about saying things, not how they feel. So we've had to go back, and people think we're very retro and not proper, but we don't say behavioral health anymore. You know, we go back to the old days. The other thing that has come up a lot is sort of the proper way to talk about homeless people now is a person experiencing homelessness. Have you seen that? So it's PEH is even, most articles about homelessness, most federal grants are all addressed to persons experiencing homelessness. And our board barfs when they hear that. They say that sounds like some academic trying to make it sound much nicer than it really is. The thought that I'm experiencing homelessness, I'm homeless is what they will say. So we've had to be very careful. And when we tried to say, well, maybe unhoused is better. And they go, it's not about being unhoused, it's about being homeless. We just understand we don't have a home. And so they push us the other way. So what I've learned, everything is okay, but there's always, you just gotta be careful. It should be said with dignity and not. So among the homeless population, people like to be called different things. It's sort of like Native American and Indian, you know, it's like,
yeah, it's like
so the
be a
second
little
part.
compassionate about the speech.
Because
right.
if I say things wrong here, it's only because I've been beaten up into saying it that way. The first question was, who do we work with? And I think we've been blessed. And I know you've also been blessed in Cambridge because you do the same thing. But we were created to not be our own organization, but to be part of everybody else's organization. So, you know, most people for the longest time thought I was a Pine Street Inn doctor. They had no idea we were also at Long Island Shelter and St. Francis and everywhere else. So we're guests in everybody's spot. So our relationship with those shelters is incredibly important. I'll never forget, just to tell you that we were doing family shelters. And I remember in some of the family shelters, you could not talk about reproductive care. They were Catholic shelters, right? And I'll never forget going in and we had to learn, okay, we have to maintain access, we have to do that. And I'll never forget the nuns quietly bringing me in and showing me the ladies' room in the family shelter, which had all of the stuff, everything. And they knew that was the one place the cardinal wouldn't go. And we started to realize, you know, we can work with everybody. We're all on the same page. We just have to do it different ways at different places. So those collaborations have been our lifeblood, including the collaborations with Mass General and with Boston Medical Center. And I have a big concern that, you know, there's the issue of how do you get out all over the community to get to people. But when people are sick, and this population that we care for tends to be very sick with all sorts of different things, they need specialty care, they need inpatient care, they need, you know, the best imaging you can get if you're going to provide them with good care. So we have, cancer turns out to be our leading cause of death. Check that, okay? Cancer is our leading cause of death. And to deliver good cancer care, we have to be really close to the cancer departments of both those hospitals. And then think of this, when people have chemotherapy and radiation now, when I was a resident, we were residents, you got admitted for that because we didn't want, you know, you were going to be sick. Now we do that as an outpatient. So imagine you've got, you know, newly diagnosed breast cancer and you've had a lumpectomy and now you're going to have radiation and chemotherapy. That's all done as an outpatient. And if you're living in a shelter on the streets, that's really difficult. So we've learned basically our relationships with the hospitals and every place else. We've had to use our respite program to let people stay for chemotherapy and radiation treatments. So our program is entirely dependent on, we're only as good as our relationship. So that question I take is really, really important, and thank you. The last thing was success story, not success story. So this is, I'm not sure what you mean by a success story, but I would say that homelessness is worse now than when I began in 1985. But I would say we have successfully given really good quality medical and psychiatric and substance use and oral care to people as they've experienced homelessness, or whatever the right word is. So there's a success in that, but the overarching thing is, as a society, we're making the problem continues to get worse and worse. So it's like a two-edged sword. So I don't want to say we're not successful. Here's another thing that might be the back end of that, and I'm sorry if I'm talking too much, is you could legitimately say, what's the outcome? What difference have we made? Why, what's the outcome we could point to that says we're good, which I think might be in part of what you mean by success. And I think we struggle with that, because is the outcome that everybody has their flu shot, or the women all are up to date with pap smears and mammograms, or is the outcome something different? And we sort of have to pay respect to both. So we try our very best to do the best we can with all the usual parameters that we look for. Flu shots, for example, everybody on the streets of Boston almost everybody got a COVID shot, mostly because we could bring it to them and give it to them ourselves. So we said, that's fabulous, But then when you step back at the end of the year, we still have people dying at rates that we can't handle. And we haven't been able to, the causes, what sets those the process of death in motion happened so long ago that we're really doing more palliative than we are preventive care. So we struggle all the time with trying to answer that success or not success. I do know that if we were funded fully, we would not eliminate homelessness. We were created to be a catalyst within the mainstream, and we were forbidden by those people to be a separate system of care. So our original goal with the 4-year grant was, if we get this up and going, then we would be out of business after 4 years, because it would be done by all the hospitals and the health centers the same way. But that got to be way more complicated as life got complicated. But the dream is still that we would be out, all the hospitals would be taking care of people the way, the way we've learned they need to be cared for. And if that happened, we don't need to be in business anymore.
I think you're still going to be in business, unfortunately. Okay, here's a question.
Thank you for those questions, by the way. That was complicated.
If you have a child whose mental illness makes it not responsible or safe to house them either with you or in an apartment with other people, what are your suggestions for supporting that child?
Whoa, this has been an issue more often than I'd like to admit. And I do adult medicine, but our family team runs into this all the time. And there's, what I would say is most family shelters live a little bit on the edge and will have a very hard time providing the right supportive environment for someone like that. And they need a better, more stable place. And I think, to be honest, the state has been relatively good at getting those families into a different spot. You all know that in Massachusetts, if any of us got homeless tonight, we could just go down to one of the shelters and go in there. But if you're a family, I'm sure you all know this, I'm telling you that, if you're a family, you have to go to the state and be vetted. And if they deem that you really are homeless and have been living, then they will assign you to a shelter. So you can't just walk into someplace. And consequently, I assume in Cambridge, same, I've never seen a family overnight in Boston, ever, outside. The only time we ever have, they might be just in from a train and then we get them to wherever they go, but we've never seen children sleeping outside. This may change with the migrant pressures coming on now. And Massachusetts remains the only state in the country with a right to shelter for homeless families. Not for adults, but for families. New York City has a right to shelter for adults, but not the state, so it's kind of complicated when you hear that. But I think this is one of the problems we all have to get to. Mental illness in children is difficult in the best of circumstances when a mom has been through hell and they end up in a shelter and also coping with a mental illness. It's overwhelming. And I don't think we have yet figured out a great way to deal with that, but we ought to be. I do know that the state tries its best, but the services are relatively limited.
Right, and here's a related question on that. What do you feel you the clinics, the shelters need from the mayor's office, from the city of Boston, from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to better serve the homeless population?
I mean, two lenses to look at that question, which I really appreciate. We are blessed. The reason we look the way we do today is because we grew up in a Boston and a Cambridge, where I think in general people were very interested in providing some sort of care for people who are homeless. It's been gratifying. When I've been to other cities, I've never seen anything quite like that. You know, frame shifting this 3 years ago. And I mean, we have 2 hospitals, and Cambridge Hospital is the same, that welcome homeless people. Do you know, I don't know another hospital in the country, that academic medical center, that has on-site dedicated services for homeless people. So we have 3 right here within a mile or so. So we've been blessed by that. And then we've had a Medicaid department of the state, which has been unbelievable at trying to make sure it reaches out to everybody. I mean, that's when we basically from 1996 on with Romney Care, every homeless person was eligible for Medicaid and therefore in the system. So we've been able to grow in ways that were not possible for my friends in Texas and Oklahoma. So I could have stopped by saying we've been really blessed.
Right, and this is actually a related question. So this person wrote, Boston is fortunate to have an extensive medical network, avenues for medical care. Do you or have you communicated with other similar regional institutions that do not have the same privilege, and how would you advise them?
We spend a lot of time. We have a lot of cities that come to see what we're doing in Boston, and they always point out, you're lucky you can do this in Massachusetts. We can't do it somewhere else. So I have to be a little realistic about that. But I've spent a lot of time in many other cities, and in every city, care of homeless people is extremely local, because you know, when you see a homeless program in one city, you've seen one. You haven't seen. They don't all look alike, and they all have to respect what the particular insurance status is in those cities, what the typical hospital and health plan situations are, and they're all radically different, unfortunately. So there's been no standard of care. What we've learned is we know there are rules. You've got to go to where homeless people are. If you wait for them to come to you, it's too late. So I think that's something we all share. And then when you do go out to them, you have to be sure there's a network behind you, and that's the hardest thing to set up. Can I divert, because what that question brings up for me is, we've learned by working hard at a place like MGH and Boston Medical Center that we can be part of that system and make sure there's continuity of care through the system and back out. But we haven't been able to do that with the same with the way mental health services are delivered. And I guess because we see the difference, it makes me crazy that we haven't brought parity to the mental health system that we have in the medical system. And so we are caught all the time. And we have 2 psychiatrists on our street team who do nothing else but take care of street people. And what we find is we can get out to them, get to know them slowly over time, earn their trust a little bit, but then there's almost no place when they really need care. It's very hard to get them into anything else. And more often than not, they'll go in for a short period of time and then come right back to the street.
Yeah, well, we deal with this at NAMI a lot,
This
where
must be your
people
thing, yes.
talk to us at our family support groups about, well, my loved one will not go to the doctor's office. And you talked about it works when you go to them, but in psychiatry, they don't do that. They're in their office, and that's the problem.
When I should have shown, I have a picture of our psychiatrist. Mass General has, but by the way, one of the problems for us was that Medicaid doesn't fund psychiatry the way it would fund medicine or behavioral health, mental health. And so we could never, we would lose money if we tried to get a psychiatrist, but we could sort of stay above water if we had a nurse practitioner or a medical nurse practitioner, PA, or a doc. And it used to drive me crazy, because for every one of us, we should have an equal and opposite therapist or psychiatrist. Just everybody needs that. We all need it. And our 2 psychiatrists on our team now, one was originally funded by Mass General as a community benefit for 5 years. So that was the only reason we got that person. And he used to run, his name was Jim Bonner, he used to run mental health centers. I don't know if you've met Jim, but he trained at Mass Mental, Harvard and Mass Mental. And he was already in his late 60s by the time he took this job because he was looking to do one last thing. And he started coming out to the streets and realizing all these people that he had seen as treatment resistant were perfectly okay to sit on a park bench and do his stuff. And I have these pictures. I used to be stunned. He'd be sitting in McDonald's doing his therapy and his prescribing. And it was like he had a renaissance in his life. There's a whole nother way to deliver care that is based on you getting to know people and being there, but going to them.
So along those lines, have you done any research or thinking or traveling around the world to other countries that just have figured some stuff out and are doing it better?
Yeah, I have done, not as much as I would love to do, but I've been to in Australia, they do it relatively well. I've been to England a lot because I've been fascinated by, they arguably have the best, most just healthcare system going, although it's teetering right now. But they struggle with the same issue about how to get people out of their offices and into places. And the obvious reason is because it's not as productive. You can see a lot of people in your office. If you go to see someone at home and then someone else, you're going to be less productive. So our goal, and several people around the country are trying to show that the long-term return on your investment of time is probably really worth it. If you just look at it as a plan, whether it helped this year, probably doesn't. So I see hope in the future, but I worry that there are, like Tony, you brought up the question about Tony. When Tony twice needed really, he's really strung out, got Section 12 when he really needed to. He let us Section 12 him because he was so out of control. Section 12, I'm sure you all know. You know this more than I do. But then he was in the emergency room for 3 or 4 days, hyperstimulated, and then ended up being sent to someplace for 10 days. One of the things, I don't have to say the name. And we went to visit him, and it was awful. It was just awful. And you realize that there just hasn't been the same.
Yeah, well, a lot of the stories that we hear at NAMI are their family's loved one goes for psychiatric care, and it's just a terrible experience. And then, as a consequence of that, they will not go again when maybe they need to, and it could be better.
That's exactly what happened to Tony. That was it. He blew out of there. We're sitting there talking to him, So I'm ashamed that we as a society have abandoned.
We're doing pretty well with the questions. We've gotten through most of them, and I think we're going to make it, believe it or not. So here's a good one. They're all good. And thank you all, by the way. These are wonderful questions. After 40 years of work with folks experiencing homelessness, do you think you could return to caring for the general population in a typical hospital setting?
Oh, I love that question.
Me too.
I didn't want to do this. I came into it kicking and shoving, but I would never, ever be able to go back. I think I lucked out. I have this great job. I work with great people. I'm on a van at night at the hospital. We do inpatient care, tending on the wards. We get to go. And now, by the way, one of the biggest things we do is take care of people who've been homeless for a long time and now in the low threshold housing. So we do home visits. We do, our team does 1,000 or 2 home visits every year now. So it's the best job ever. And we follow people long term. And there's nothing, I think in many ways, that's what kept us going. You can see in the story of Tony, as we got to know him, we realized the person we met the first day was not at all the real person, and we learned that over 5 or 10 years, So I would never go back. I worry that what we have been doing works, I think truly works for a very vulnerable population, but would never work for the system as a whole. But why can't we do both? Why can't we have a continuum where this is part of a bigger system, but just like I imagine in several clinics, for the, in psychiatric situation, you need more time to spend with people than less time. Same for us in medicine. So I think you've taught us about time. We haven't learned it as well.
Here's a question. We've covered some of this, but let's see. As someone who works with this person is saying, as someone who works with the highest utilizers of the BMC emergency department, how would you advise I work to reconcile the longitudinal effort and time it takes to build trust with the strain and burnout of medical providers that see my patients returning to their care multiple times a week? most of whom believe in foot washing but can only wash the same pair of feet so often?
That is a really profound question. My first take on that is I worry a lot about the emergency room because I don't know if you remember in medieval times, I'll never forget in reading whatever the history was, in medieval times if there's anything wrong in your town, they were brought to the sanctuary of the cathedral. It was safe, which is where the sanctuary. It didn't matter what was going on in town, they brought them to the sanctuary. And I kind of think we have created a society where anything goes wrong, certainly in our town, anybody sees something wrong, that person gets sent to the emergency room. It's our sort of front door. And so in the emergency room where we're geared for trauma, heart attacks, everything else, they also get this huge number of societal problems that are long-term problems. And it is a formula for burning everybody to a crisp. It's not satisfying the person who needs all this stuff. The person under pressure in the emergency room has, another 10 minutes before the next trauma and they don't do well. So I worry about that as that's the face that many of us as clinicians see when you meet homeless people, and it's the worst way to go. So our goal is always how do you do as much as you can before the emergency room, or make sure everybody in an emergency room knows you don't have to answer all that. Just tell us what we're going to do. We'll follow that person. So continuity is possible. I think the most frustrating thing for my friends in the emergency room is they see someone, they don't know what to do, and they know when they let them go, they're not sure anything will happen. And having the comfort of knowing there's a bit of continuity there is what I think is the goal for all of us.
So you've worked out a pretty remarkable relationship with Mass General and BMC and what you're doing. Are you confident about the durability of those relationships?
Not at all, because I realize
that was not the answer I was hoping for.
I'm confident I'm confident that we have to nurture those relationships all the time. And the turnover in the emergency room staff, the changes in emergency rooms, means you've got to constantly go back to do that. When we have those contacts, so it works. And we try hard to continue. But I think it requires a lot of time and effort to keep those going.
And where do on your end of the fence, where do your providers come from? The nurses, the doctors? What's kind of your feeder system for those people?
That's another great question. And to let you know what happened is one of the challenges for me was when I came out to do this job, I was going to do it for a year. Remember, I told you they didn't like that. But the reason I was only going to do it for a year is there was no career path to do this. You could only do it for a short time as basically a time of doing good. But you couldn't get promoted in the medical school. There was no job to do. And so one of the challenges was how do you create a career path within medical schools and nursing schools for this to happen? So that was our early challenge. And I think if we've succeeded in one little thing, now that we have the 30 doctors and 40 nurses, we've been able to create a network where people choose to do this as their job. And I have to hasten here, Barbara McGinnis one of the first things she said to me early on was she looked at me and she said, "You aren't some kind of saint or zealot, are you?" And I said, "No, I'm a bartender that got pushed into doing this." And she went, "Great, because they're awful to work with. We need people to just do this as a job." And I will never forget that, because that is exactly true. You want to create a job that doesn't depend on you being passionate about saving people, but passionate about caring for people. And what we've then been blessed with is almost all of our doctors and nurses have, when they were students, either medical students or nursing students or residents, spent time rotating through our program so they can see what's going on. Then they can see exactly what they want to choose or not choose. And that's, we have chief residents from all of the hospitals in town working with us now because they spent time with us. So that's been really wonderful. So I would match our staff quality-wise, our nurses and our doctors, to any place. And they're pretty devastatingly good.
That's fantastic. Well, believe it or not, we actually answered all the questions in the time allotted. And so we have just a couple minutes. Is there anything that you would like to share with our NAMI audience, especially, and we also have audience from Cambridge. We kind of have two audiences mixed together here. But our NAMI audience is, obviously very concerned about their loved ones with severe mental illness that may be homeless or in and out of homelessness. And I just wonder if you have any last words of advice for us.
No, I think the one thing I would share with you is that, so my mother had terrible bipolar illness, had 6 children, and so we spent most of our youth worried about, and she had mostly depressive symptoms, responded only to ECT. So I grew up with this horrifying, this wonderful mother who disappeared and then only got better when she got this horrible stuff. So I remember, as a family, struggling with how do you deal with something we didn't understand, and the treatment looked brutal rather than nice. So I would just share with you that I feel really, I feel really close to what the problem is that you are all doing. And I face it every day when I see the people who are homeless. We had a home, and a place to at least work from. When I see people with similar and often worse problems without a place to live, it's really devastating. So I really admire what all of you are willing to do, and actually look to you for the kind of answers that you hear me struggling with tonight, because I'm not sure that we as a society are ready to face the problems that you know all so well. And I'm way downstream with all of our staff, and I'm sure the Cambridge staff is the exact same way, seeing what happens when we don't have a system to take care of people. So, that's all I would share. I'd say I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Linda, for inviting me, and Rich because this is something near and dear to my heart as well. So not just a story of 40 years, but really a story of my whole 77 years.
Well, we can't thank you enough for spending time with us, and I think what you have done and your colleagues is fabulous. So I would say it's the success story, okay? I'm going to say that.
You tell that to my father.
So, thank you very much. Just a reminder that I've been reminded to remind you that May 17th is the NAMI Walk, and it starts on the Boston Common, and if you'd like to join us, that would be great. If you go on the NAMI website, you'll find all about us. You're welcome to donate, of course, we always appreciate that. But I want to thank you, Jim, so much for sharing your time with us, and wish you all the best.